All right, so we have now moved to Module 2, which is the module on the U.S. Constitution, which might be my favorite of all the modules, possibly. Civil liberties is pretty fun too. We'll get to that one soon. But right now, we're going to talk about the Constitution. It's going to take a full module to do this because there is a lot to discuss here. And obviously, the Constitution is the most important document in U.S. history. You could argue, I guess, the Declaration of Independence is, because without it, probably no Constitution. But in terms of like our day-to-day lives and like importance on the government we have right now, I would say the Constitution is probably the most important declaration, close second, perhaps. But anyway, so we need to talk today about what the Constitution is, what it says, what rights it established, why we ended up with the Constitution we have, et cetera, et cetera. Or do that, we need to talk about quite a bit of history and quite a bit of law here. All right, so talk about the Constitution. Why did we end up with the ones we had? Well, the Constitution was written during the Enlightenment. The founders, people who wrote the Constitution, folks at the Philadelphia Convention where the Constitution was written, all of them were men of the Enlightenment. All of them were influenced by the Enlightenment. And what that means is they had generally a respect for and a belief in the power of science, the power of like empirical reasoning, logic, things like that. They also generally believe that humans were naturally rational and good. They obviously had all the blind spots that people of that time tended to have. They didn't include women or minorities for the most part in this process, which is obviously to their discredit. But nonetheless, they were, I think it's fair to say, ahead of their time in what they proposed. So, why did they see the world as they saw it? Well, they were, for the most part, like I said, men of the Enlightenment. They were classically educated, and by that I mean many of them were obsessed with Roman and history and the ancient Greeks and the philosophical traditions and the legal traditions that came from those eras. They were also very much influenced by the philosophers of the Enlightenment, one of whom being a guy named Thomas Hobbes. Now, Thomas Hobbes wrote a book called Leviathan, in which he argued that an unquestioned sovereign was necessary to provide order. His argument was he lived at a time of great societal upheaval, the gunpowder plot in London, where Guy Fawkes was exposed before he could blow up Parliament. We had two French kings in a row assassinated, and people in Hobbes' day believed that all this disorder was a sign of societal decline. We were getting too far away from our traditional values, Christianity, etc. This was in the 1500s. So, what does this mean about? So, does any of this sound familiar now? I mean, this is pretty much a recurring theme throughout world history. People think that we're in decline when we may actually oftentimes are not. And I said 1500s. I'm sorry, I meant 1600s, but point stands. Hobbes had a pretty dour view of human nature. You ever heard of the comic strip Calvin and Hobbes? Well, Hobbes, the tiger, is named after Thomas Hobbes. Calvin is named after John Calvin, who was a Protestant theologian. But Hobbes's view is humans are pretty flawed, pretty bad, basically. And thus, they need an unquestioned sovereign to rule over them. We need a strong, iron fisted ruler. And so his view was that we should delegate our powers to such a ruler who will govern us fairly. Now, this is influential only in the sense on the founders is possibly an anti-example, but also an example of a social contract. Remember what I said? We agree to an unquestioned sovereign who will rule fairly. That's a social contract. The founders generally had a much more positive view of human nature than Hobbes did. So he was influential mostly for the concept of a social contract, not so much for his views on human nature. But the founders did agree that, for the most part, that certain aspects of human nature did need to be restrained because humans aren't perfect. Another philosopher was a French philosopher, the Baron Montesquieu, who gave us the concept of three branches of government, which obviously is going to get written into their Constitution. Probably the single most influential of the Enlightenment philosophers on our founders, though, would be John Locke, who was an English philosopher who argued that legitimacy only comes through consent of the governed. Locke also argued that humans have three natural rights, and I bet you can guess two of them: life, liberty, and the third is property, not the pursuit of happiness. But you probably recognize the first two from the Declaration of Independence, which Jefferson wrote. Obviously, he was drawing on the tradition that Locke had established here. Locke believed very much, believed basically humans are good and rational. Didn't believe they were perfect, but he did believe that most humans, most of the time, will do the right thing. Thus, he did believe in a Republican, democratic Republican form of government. He also believed that any government which doesn't respect the three natural rights, which he outlined, was illegitimate and should be changed. So he also believed that, like Hobbes, that legitimacy comes only from consent of the governed. So he was an advocate of a social contract theory as well, but he had a much more positive view of human nature than Locke did. So as you can see, founders are really going to be drawing from Locke when it comes to their ideas about human nature, human rights, et cetera, et cetera. All right, some other foundations, other things that influenced the Constitution we ended up getting. One would be the Magna Carta, which in Latin means Grand Charter, which was established in 1215 in Runnymede, England. So King John was King of England. He was, by all accounts, not a great king, not a very good king. He was more interested in partying and getting drunk and sleeping with women and all this, I guess you could say the fun aspects of being king. He was not so much a fan of diplomacy, statecraft, managing a budget, the responsibilities of being king. And so his barons got fed up with him and basically threatened to revolt if he didn't sign a document called the Magna Carta, which established that the king, there's a lot, it's complicated. I'm giving you a very, very, very broad overview here. But basically that the king has to follow the same rules as everyone else. You probably know there is still a king of England today, King Charles, but you probably also know that in terms of actual power, he has very little. He's mostly a figurehead. This is the result of a process which began with the Magna Carta. This is the first time that we've established the powers of the king are not absolute. And over time, power is going to shift more and more away from the monarchy and more towards the parliament, specifically the House of Commons. All right, no Magna Carta, probably no constitution. Also, the Petition of Right in England, which established that commoners have a right to a voice in government, which, today in England, there's the House of Commons, which is distinct from the House of Lords. The House of Lords is for the nobility, people with titles and nobility. The House of Commons is for commoners. And the House of Commons is really where the power today is exercised in England. House of Lords is kind of like the monarchy in that it's a throwback, symbolic, but doesn't have a whole lot of real power anymore. This was 1628. In 1688, the English Bill of Rights was established, which provided for free elections and fair trials for English citizens. So we see freedom being extended to more and more English citizens. You may know though, that in the colonies, the colonists were not English citizens. They were English subjects, which means they did not get all the rights of English citizens, which is going to be one of the focal points, which is going to obviously lead to the revolution. Some other foundations in colonial governments: Mayflower Compact. This is a first government in North America established based on a social contract. Most of the male heads of households, when they arrived at Plymouth, signed this document to establish a civil body politic. It's notable for being the first government in North America based on a social contract. In terms of influencing the Constitution, though, probably not that much, but it's still important in that because it was the first. Each colony, all the 13 colonies, had a charter, which basically is a constitution. Each colony had a colonial legislature, which was elected by property-owning men. So these are aspects that would be carried over generally when we get independence. But the colonies were established based on the idea of mercantilism, which meant that they existed to create wealth for the mother country, in this case, England. So they were sort of the fair-haired stepchildren, I guess you could say, of the British system. Didn't have the full rights of British citizens because they were British subjects. So what is a constitution? It's a document or set of documents that establish the basic rules and procedures for how a society should be governed. Doesn't have to be a single document necessarily. Can be a series of documents, can be unwritten. In Great Britain, for instance, the British Constitution is not a single document. It's a series of documents, precedents, and traditions. So they don't have a written constitution the same way we do. The documents included among the British Constitution would be the English Bill of Rights, the Magna Carta, and court decisions. The U.S. Constitution is the longest surviving written constitution in the world. Why is that? Well, one reason probably is the amendment process. We can change it if we need to, but we'll get to that here in a little bit. So we'll stop right now. Next, when we come up, we'll head towards the Revolutionary War and towards how we got the Constitution we have.